Back with us for day 2 of 10 days of special programming is Joel C. Rosenberg, author of Epicenter, Why the Current Rumblings in the Middle East Will Change Your Future. In this series, he's helping us to make sense of the constant headlines we see coming out of the Middle East, especially as they relate to Israel. He also suggests some possible headlines we're likely to read in the near future based on Bible prophecy. Joel has often been called on for his comment by many news media outlets such as ABC Nightline, CNN Headline News, Fox News, MSNBC, and many others. And he's with us for this special series as we consider how we can redeem the time God has given us before the soon return of Christ. Joel, welcome again.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate it.
Now, Joel, yesterday you started talking about the novels that you began to write after you kind of left the political arena in Washington, and then some very uncanny things began to happen because of the timing of the novels and what was happening, especially in the Middle East. So maybe you can share some of those stories.
Sure,
and how that what happened as a result of these things.
Well, I set out to write a series of political thrillers, novels. I mean, it was fiction. Okay, I was going to make this stuff up, and having a failed political career of helping a bunch of candidates lose their elections, Israeli and American leaders. At least out of that, I had gained some insights into issues that were coming up over the horizon, threats to the United States. But remember, in January 2001, when I began writing The Last Jihad, the United States had had a very close election. President Bush had, won by like 500 votes or something in Palm Beach, Florida. It had gone to the Supreme Court. Nobody was talking about radical jihad, Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction. The things we talk about today, we weren't talking about then. We were talking about hanging chads and, tax cuts and stuff. But I sat down to write a novel, and the novel that began to come out of me, I entitled The Last Jihad. And as I said on yesterday's show, the first page of The Last Jihad puts you inside the cockpit of a jet plane hijacked by radical Islamic terrorists coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. Now, I wrote that 9 months before September 11th, 2001. And fictionally, in the novel, it leads from this kamikaze attack on America to a war between the United States and Saddam Hussein over terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Now, regardless of what the audience may think about the politics of what actually did happen, remember, when I was writing this, I was just making this up. And so I wrote this novel, and then 9/11 happened. I mean, I was literally finishing it on the morning of September 11th in Washington, D.C., where my wife and my boys live, and suddenly our city was under attack. Our country was under attack, and we didn't know at that moment, was there going to be a 9/12, a 9/13, a 9/14, or was it going to be a whole series of attacks? The last thing on my mind was, oh my goodness, how do I, publish a novel? I mean, I knew I couldn't. I mean, I literally thought, well, that's 9 months of my life that I've wasted. It wasn't so important at that time because, we had America was at war with radical Islam, But I thought, there's no way I'm ever going to publish a novel. What am I going to do? Send it to a New York-based publisher? A book that opens up with a kamikaze attack? Never going to happen. I put it in a drawer. I tried to forget about it. But then came January 2002, and President Bush gave his State of the Union address in which he talked about the axis of evil and said the next threat we may have to face as Americans is a war with Saddam Hussein. Well, then my wife and I look at each other like we're sitting in an episode of The Twilight Zone. My agent calls me the next day and says, do you work for the CIA? And I said, no. He said, oh, come on, sure, that's what you'd have to say if you did work for the CIA and you just couldn't tell me. I said, I don't. He said, well, I think the dynamic has just changed. Americans, aside from the rest of the world, but Americans have gone from being, just stunned, angry, disoriented by the 9/11 attack. So now we're thinking, well, what would be involved in having to go to war with Saddam? What are those discussions going to be inside the White House, in the Oval Office, in the Situation Room, in Israel, in Iraq, around the world? And your novel takes us into that. I think we should publish it. I said, you sure? Because I don't. He said, yes, nobody else has written something like this. I mean, even if somebody wanted to write a scenario like this, they would have had to start on September 12th. But this book was already done. Well, when The Last Jihad was in fact published in November of 2002, no one had ever heard of Joel Rosenberg or The Last Jihad. But suddenly, The book hit #1 on Amazon.com, hit the New York Times bestseller list for 11 straight weeks, was reprinted 9 times in less than 2 months. And I was on 160 radio and television shows talking about these things. I'd never been on radio or television at all.
So you started getting calls from all over because of the uncanny, amazing so-called coincidence or whatever of the things coming true that you had already written about. And so what was it like hitting all these media outlets?
Well, it was a bit overwhelming, and every question was the same. How could you have known this was going to happen? And I said, well, I didn't know this was going to happen. There are differences in the last jihad from what happened. In my book, it's a private jet, a Gulfstream 5 jet that is hijacked, not a commercial airliner. Honestly, I wasn't so convinced commercial airliners were as vulnerable as they turned out to be. The attack happens in Denver. Actually, the flight is coming in from Canada, and it comes into to Denver as opposed to New York or Washington. There were differences, but people said, well, yeah, but conceptually, I mean, no one had ever written a novel about radical Islamic jihadists, holy warriors, hijacking a plane and flying it as a kamikaze mission. I said, well, this comes from my experience working for the former Prime Minister of Israel and the former Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, spending a lot of time in the region. These were the concerns I had. And Saddam Hussein had been a threat for a long time. Every intelligence agency around the world believed at the time that we knew he had used weapons of mass destruction, so it didn't seem implausible that in a novel, if the United States was attacked by terrorists from the Middle East, an American president's eye would turn towards a man who'd used weapons of mass destruction and worry that those weapons could wind up in the hands of terrorists and therefore maybe launch a regime change type operation. And then it happened. I mean, and so and people would ask me these questions, and they'd say, so how did you know? What do you think is going to happen next? And isn't your name Rosenberg? And I'd say, yeah. And they say, well, isn't that Jewish? And I'd say, well, yeah. They said, but you've got these characters at the end of the book. They're all in the midst of danger, and they're all wondering what's going to happen when they die, and they all start talking about Jesus, don't they? I said, well, a few of them do. And they said, well, what are you, a born-again Christian? An evangelical Christian? As though in the media that was like the worst concept in the world. I said, well, yes, that's true. And they said, well, how is that possible? How can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus? And I'd say things like, well, it's an interesting story. It's not one you have time for me to tell on your program right now. And they say, oh, wait. It's one thing to have a guy who writes novels that come true on our show. It's another thing to meet a Jew who believes in Jesus. That story you need to tell me. and just as you did, people asked me to tell that story. And in less than 60 days, I had the privilege of talking about my faith in Jesus as the Messiah with 20 million people in the United States. And this set into motion a new book deal, and people saying, why don't you keep writing? And I thought, well, it beats working. Okay,
Well, what an amazing platform, though. That was just overnight. That you had opportunity to share with that many people some of your most deeply held beliefs, not just some of your novel ideas.
Right.
Now, we need to take a break, and later when we come back, I want to ask you how even. Because I know a lot of what you write about is based on biblical prophecy, how there was even an inkling of this, the first novel, The Last Jihad, may have been sparked through any knowledge of Bible prophecy also. So we'll talk more about that when we come back. But we do want to get into your hands the copy of Joel's book, Epicenter, Why the Current Rumblings in the Middle East Will Change Your Future. Thank you also for your support of the Ministry of Crossroads. We can't do it without you. And so we'll be back, Joel, in just a little bit.
Sounds good.